driving some awesome Jeeps. The white Jeep I'm in right now is a GenRight Elite chassis. It's actually owned by GenRight. It has a L86 with an 8-speed, but it does have an LT2 intake. The white Jeep is Moby. It has a L86 with an LT1 intake and a 10-speed. And the yellow Jeep has got double throwdown with an LT1, a real LT1 engine. It's not an L86 that's been updated. So as you can guess, let's talk about suspension. Now the suspension systems on these Jeeps are ridiculously expensive for most of us. The rolling Elite chassis I'm in with the Dana 70s runs something like $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. That's not including the body, but what you do get is a frame, and they basically buy a stock frame from Chrysler. I hear now they're making some of their own bespoke frames from scratch on the JLs. Not sure about the JKs, but they trick it out. They add a true 4-link, which is really the biggest part of this conversion. They do have a 3-link up front. Some guys love it, some guys hate it. I can tell you it works pretty awesome off-road. My only concern with the 3-link, well, there's two concerns. One is if you lose that 3rd link, you're screwed, as unlikely as that is. 2, having that upper control arm sticking off the top of the front differential can cause interferences. Now, Tony over at GenRight was moving his engine over towards the passenger side, and the stock JK has the engine moved over 5/8 of an inch to the passenger side. So there's a lot of stuff going on down there. You got your drive shaft, you got your exhaust, you got that 3rd link. It all works, it's just packaged a little bit more tight. Now if we talk about the rear suspension, that's where the Elite chassis really shines, because we have a true 4-link. What that means is we're not running a panhard rod. Now I call it a panhard rod because I'm old school, but it's what you guys call a track bar. And the track bar, because it pivots at one end, it swings the axle through an arc. And when it swings through that arc, that axle is going to move left and right. Now in 99% of driving situations, you're never going to notice that. But if you're off-road going fast and you're hitting whoop-de-doos and that axle's flipping up and down, you're going to feel that tail wag a little bit with a panhard rod. Now there are some fancy panhard rods like Z-bars, which do make the axle go straight up and down, but they're more complicated, less reliable. With the true 4-link, what we can do is get rid of the track bar, run the 4-link setup so that the axle goes perfectly straight up and down, and you might notice a little bit of difference, but there's also a downside to that, and the downside is the fuel tank, because the passenger side upper control arm has to go right where the fuel tank was. We got to get rid of the stock fuel tank and put a fuel tank in the back. Now of course this has the GenRight fuel tank, and it's a very well-built fuel tank, but there are some downsides to that, whether it's emissions legality or the way the sending unit reads out on your dash or putting fuel in. This tank doesn't have a true fill valve. The fill valve is when you push fuel into the fuel inlet, it drops a fill valve that vents to the evap canister and allows you to push the fuel in fast. Now in this one I can push it in there pretty good. Some of them I've had to kind of drip in. The other thing is the sending unit, depending on how you set it up, doesn't really read the entire travel of the tank. So there's some downsides, and of course there's upsides. So the Elite chassis with a 3-link in the front and a 4-link in the back is an awesome setup. If we compare that to the Evo double throwdowns that are in this video, they're running the track bar in the rear with long arms, which still works awesome. With a long arm and the track bar set up properly, I don't think you'll ever notice a difference. I can't say that you could go faster with one of these than the other off-road. I can't go that fast, at least. But one of the advantages of the double throwdown is Mel lays that suspension system down in the back right underneath the floorboard, which allows you to maintain your stock fuel tank. And maintaining the stock fuel tank is good for us because we're an engine conversion company, and that way the fuel pump and the wiring and the evap and all that just stays where it's at, and it's easier for us. The double throwdown does run the coilovers and the full 4-link in the front, which I like. And really what these suspension systems come down to, if you ask which one's better, personally, I've driven lots of both, and what I would say is it's your setup. It's how you set the thing up. The Jeep I'm in right now is a little bit too stiff for me on the highway, but we were off-road with it, going pretty fast over the big stuff, and it rides really smooth. So you have to kind of compromise and pick what you want. If you get that boulevard ride where it's really soft on the highway, it's not going to be ideal for off-road. Moby, as you can see, has got some pretty trick. I think there were some prototype Dynatrac axles way back in the day, but he's got Dynatrac 80 front and rear, and the Dynatrac 80s do cause more friction. They do use more power to go down the road. So keep that in mind, like with fuel economy. Now, of course, the flip side to that is Moby's axles are really strong and they don't break. So again, everything is a compromise. Speaking of axles, I get the question all the time, do I need to upgrade? And the answer in general is no. I mean, if you're in 33s, 35s, Dana 44, Dana 30 even, is probably gonna work for you. However, if you drive aggressively, if you tow a trailer, if you are gonna go past 35s, 37s, 40s, 42s, then you're gonna have to upgrade. If you're gonna crawl and go out and do rock waterfalls, of course you've gotta upgrade. Now, you can upgrade the 44 axles. It's a good axle, and they do respond well to hardened axle shafts and trussing and welding up the C's and all that, and we've got lots of guys out there on that, and it's budget compared to buying new axles, because new axles are getting pretty darn expensive. We do a lot of axles in the shop, and I'd say the average set of custom axles is running $15,000 to $20,000, and that's not small change. But if you are going to run 40s and you're going to go out and whomp on it, then that's what you're going to need. So let's talk about us mere mortals. What works for us? Well, I got a Metal Cloak Game Changer on my Jeep, and I'm going to call the Game Changer a midline suspension system, because you guys know that there's the low-end suspension systems, and I'm not going to say names, but some of those suspension systems just aren't going to give you what you need as far as ride, sound, because, you know, some of the polyurethane joints are squeaky. They're exactly what they are, a budget suspension system. But the mid-grade suspension systems are going to work for most of us. Whether it's the Rock Crawler, Jeremy over there is a good guy, or Metal Cloak, Scott and Mattson and all those guys, Synergy, Poly, everybody's got a pretty cool mid-end suspension system. We're doing some Evo coilovers right now, and that's not nearly as expensive as a double throwdown, but I'll tell you, those Evo bolt-on coilovers really work excellent, especially if you get the long arm. So like everything else in the Jeep world, I'm going to tell you, first determine what is your need. And I say that because I get guys out there that read a magazine and then they want everything that's the biggest and the best and the baddest so they can go run Johnson Valley, but it's miserable to drive on road, and they spent a lot of money. So as far as the mid-grade suspension systems go, if you're running 35s, 37s, you're going to drive your Jeep to work every day, it's a daily driver, and then you're going to go out and be a weekend warrior, maybe run the Rubicon or go to Moab, then a mid-grade suspension system will work fine for you. Now I'm just going to take a Metal Cloak mid-arm, for example, and I call it a mid-arm because if you look at the TJs, they had pretty short control arms, so we call them a short arm suspension. But the JK arms are considerably longer, so I'm going to call it a mid-arm. And if you get a suspension system like the Metal Cloak Game Changer, and now there's a lot of other companies offering a similar joint to the Metal Cloak Duraflex joint, because what the Metal Cloak Duraflex joint does is it rotates in the housing, so it doesn't limit your travel. One of the reasons you go to a long arm is not only to reduce the suspension geometry angles, but you have to have rubber at one end for comfort on the highway, because if you had like two Clevites or Johnny joints, the arm's just gonna clack, clack, clack back and forth. There's nothing to center it. So by running a rubber joint on one end, that will prevent that. The problem with running that rubber joint though is when you try to get a high travel suspension, you're gonna rip that joint. So Metal Cloak solved that problem by allowing a rubber joint to rotate in the housing, and that way you get the self-centering characteristics of the rubber joint, but you're not limited to travel. So if you go and look at the RTI index, Mattson, I remember, used to drive a truck around and bring it here. They're really high. Those suspension systems perform really well for what they are. They're going to cost you a lot less money. A lot of this is going to come down to the shocks. Shocks have a lot to do with the performance off-road especially. Now you can spend a ton of money on Fox or King or whatever, or you can go to a midline shock. I like the OME or the Old Man Emu shocks because they're old man shocks. They tend to ride smoother. They're not as good on the big stuff, but for what I do, they work for me. Then you got, of course, Kayaba and Bilstein and all the stuff in the middle there. And I would say for most guys, that's where you want to be. You want to be with a midline suspension system, Poly, Synergy, Metal Cloak, and even AEV. I'm not a big fan of the drop suspension systems. You want it to drive stock on the highway, but you also want it to handle whatever you're going to be doing off-road. You need to have enough travel to get over that big stuff. Now remember, your differential clearance is going to limit where you can go, because we have a trail here. We call it White Canyon or Potato Ridge. I don't know. They just call it a bunch of stuff, but it's behind Red Rock. At one point, there's the Rock Garden. At least it's called the Rock Garden, and there's boulders like the size of refrigerators any direction you go. So I know that people have had a hard time going through there because I see car parts strewn around, shocks and skid plates and things. So you could have the best suspension in the world, but if you don't have enough ground clearance, you're going to be dragging those axles. What I find is if you know how to drive and you know how to position your wheel and tire, you can get over the big stuff. Because if you know where your pumpkin is, where that axle's hanging down, you can kind of pick and choose the obstacle so that you don't drag that differential. But obviously the solution for that would be portal axles. I'm just kidding. Unless you got a lot of money or you want a Mercedes, the solution is just to get larger tires. Now remember, if you go up 1 inch in size in a tire, you're only gaining half an inch of differential clearance. Now when it comes to the real high horsepower stuff, like the LT4s, and I'm even going to put the LT1 in this category, it does put extra stress on the suspension system. So I do like to see rubber in the suspension system because it tends to absorb that shock. Also, if you have a high travel floppy suspension system, be careful with that, because those floppy suspension systems are really designed to be unstable. It's kind of like an aerobatic plane. It's unstable so it can be maneuverable, but you got to know how to fly it. And it's the same thing with this floppy suspension system. I've been off-road with them. You can get into trouble with them pretty easy, and you put 400 or 500 horsepower into it, you can get into trouble even easier. One of the things you want to watch is your squat. Depending on the geometry of your suspension system, when you launch, your Jeep should not jump up a foot in the air, and that's a lot of what these suspension systems do, because they're really not designed to drag race. They're designed to go over obstacles. So all the tricks we did in the old days, the traction bars and third links, apply here. What you want is something that's going to go straight when you floor it, go straight when you slam on the brakes, go straight down the highway so you're not chasing the steering wheel. And I'm going to say, and this is probably conservative, 30 to 40% of the Jeeps that I drive that come in the shop with modified suspension systems aren't set up right. They don't go down the road right. The arms or the control arm brackets aren't welded on right. And when I drive them long distance, it drives me nuts, because you're constantly chasing the steering wheel left and right, trying to keep it in the lane. Other ones, like the one I'm in right now, is awesome. In fact, I just did drive a very well set up Jeep to Salt Lake, and I could let the wheel go, and that thing was straight as an arrow. So another component to the suspension system is you can buy the best suspension system in the world, but it has to be set up properly. So go to a shop that knows what they're doing, knows the alignment of four-wheel drive systems, because things like drive shaft angle, your pinion angle is very important. If you were to order a stock axle and stick it in a Jeep with a 6-inch lift, your pinion angle is going to be way off. You're going to have problems with vibrations. You're going to have problems with brake and drive shafts and joints. So take it to somebody that knows what they're doing and have it installed. Most of the suspension systems today in the middle are designed for a 4-door JK with a 3-inch lift, because that's what most of us do. That'll set your pinion angle up right. They usually give you an adjustable track bar or a track bar offset bracket, because remember, the track bars have to run in sync front to rear. They have to center the axle at ride height, and they have to also be in the same plane as the drag link where it attaches to the spindle. That way you don't have any bump or torque steer. Go back and watch my video from a few years ago. I explain all that. And if you do that, you'll have a Jeep that drives like a dream. If you don't do that, it's going to be Mr. Toad's Wild Ride with an LT1. So I've yacked enough. I'm glad you got a chance to see some pretty awesome Jeeps. I'm going to talk more about wheels and tires and suspension in an upcoming video.